The transition from the chaos of the gala back to the sterile silence of the park estate felt like surfacing for air after nearly drowning. The hum of the medical monitors was rhythmic, a dull pulse that echoed the throbbing in Amara's shoulder. When she finally opened her eyes, the ceiling was a vast expanse of pristine white, a stark contrast to the blood-slicked marble floors of her nightmares. She shifted, a sharp hiss escaping her teeth as the movement pulled at the fresh stitches in her side. Memories came back in jagged fragments, the screech of tires outside the market, the glint of a silver barrel leveled at a woman who looked too regal for the pavement, and the sudden, heavy heat of lead tearing through her own flesh. Amara had spent her life delivering packages on a deadline, navigating the city's veins to stay one step ahead of the bills, but she had never delivered her own life as a shield. "You're awake. Good. The doctor said a girl with your physique shouldn't have been able to stay conscious as long as you did." The voice was like velvet pulled over a blade. Amara turned her head slowly to find Daesham Park sitting in an armchair by the window. He didn't look like the morning sun of a woman who had almost been assassinated. He looked like a man who had spent the last several hours rearranging the stars to suit his purpose. He was dressed in a charcoal suit that looked more expensive than the bike she totaled, and his eyes, dark, calculating, and impossibly deep, were fixed on her with a frightening intensity. Across the room, Mrs. Eun-hee Park sat in a wheelchair, her arm in a sling but her posture as straight as a spine of iron. The matriarch didn't speak, but the look she gave Amara wasn't one of pity. It was a look of recognition. Amara tried to sit up, her voice raspy. "My family, they think I'm working a double shift. I need to go." "Your family is being taken care of," Daesham said, rising from his seat. The way he moved was predatory, a controlled grace that made the air in the room feel thin. He walked to the edge of the bed, looking down at her not as a patient, but as a masterpiece he had just discovered. "Jerome is at home. Your brother is at school. They believe you were involved in a minor traffic accident and are resting in a private clinic. In a way, it is the truth." "Why am I here?" Amara asked, her fingers clutching the high-thread count sheets. "I saved your mother. That's it. Give me a check or a thank you, and let me go back to my life." Daesham leaned down, his face inches from hers. The scent of sandalwood and expensive scotch hit her, grounding her and making her heart race simultaneously. "Your life is over, Amara. The men who tried to kill my mother saw your face. They saw you intervene. If you walk out that door as a courier, you're a dead woman. And more importantly, my mother believes her life is now tethered to yours. She sees a resilience in you that my enemies lack." He turned toward the window, looking out at the glittering Chicago skyline, the undisputed king of all he surveyed. "The Park Syndicate is at a crossroads. My rivals expect me to marry into the Kim or Lee families to solidify a traditional alliance. They expect a bride who will sit quiet and look pretty while they plot to take my head. They are waiting for a weakness." He turned back, his expression unreadable, the greatest mind of the underworld moving his final piece. "I am making a decision no one saw coming. I am not marrying a princess of the underworld. I am marrying the woman who took a bullet meant for the crown. I am declaring you my partner, my bride, and the new sovereign of this organization." Amara's breath hitched. "You're insane. I'm a delivery girl from the South Side. I don't know your world. Your people will kill me before I even say I do." "That is exactly why they won't see it coming," Daesham countered, his voice dropping to a low, vibrating silk. "They will see a girl they can intimidate, while I will be training a weapon they can't handle. I don't want a wife to warm my bed, Amara. I want a strategist who understands the streets better than my lieutenants. I want the girl who calculated the trajectory of a bullet and chose to stand in its path." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a ring, a heavy, platinum band set with a diamond as black as the obsidian floors of his study. He didn't offer it with a bended knee. He held it out like a contract signed in blood. "You want to save your family? You want Jerome to never worry about rent again? You want your brother to have every door in this country open for him? Then you step into this gilded cage. You trade your courier bike for a throne. You become the grace that this syndicate needs and the shadow they fear. Amara looked at the ring, then at Mrs. Eunhee, who nodded once, a silent command from one queen to a potential successor. She thought of the cold dinners at her kitchen table, the late-night calls from debt collectors, and the look of exhaustion on her father's face. Then she looked at Daesham Park, a man who offered her a life of danger, but also a life of power. She realized then that this was the most dangerous delivery she would ever make. She wasn't just delivering a package, she was delivering her soul to a man who saw her as a weapon. "What happens if I say no?" she whispered. Daesham's smile was ghost-faint and chilling. "Then you remain a victim of a story that's already been written. But if you say yes, we set this city on fire together. And you, Amara Sterling, will be the one holding the match." Slowly, with a hand that trembled only slightly, Amara reached out. The metal was cold against her skin, the weight of it a permanent anchor. As the black diamond slid onto her finger, the silence of the room felt like a heavy curtain falling on her old life. The courier was dead. The sovereign was rising. And as Daesham took her hand, his grip possessive and firm, Amara knew that the world was about to learn that grace wasn't just about kindness, it was about surviving the fire. The moment of change from a hospital bed to the east wing of the Park estate was a blur of tinted windows and silent men with earpieces. For Amara, the change was more than just physical, it was atmospheric. The air in the estate didn't just feel cleaner, it felt heavier, charged with the static of unspoken commands and centuries of tradition. Her side still burned where the bullet had grazed her, a constant reminder that her old life as a courier was a ghost she could no longer chase. She found herself in a sun-drenched conservatory, the scent of jasmine and expensive floor wax replacing the sterile hospital musk. At the center of the room sat Mrs. Eunhee Park. The Iron Matriarch looked anything but frail today. Wrapped in a silk hanbok that shimmered like a dragonfly's wing, she was meticulously trimming a bonsai tree. She didn't look up when Amara entered. "Sit, Amara," the older woman commanded. It wasn't an invitation. It was an anchor. Amara sat on the edge of a carved wooden chair, her hands resting awkwardly on her knees. She felt like a stain on the perfection of the room. "I'm told I should be thanking you for the care I've received, Mrs. Park." The shears snipped a single, tiny leaf. "You saved my life." Gratitude is a debt, and in this family, we do not like carrying debts. But my son, Daesham, he sees more than a debt in you. He sees a foundation. Eunhee finally looked up, her eyes sharp as glass. "But a foundation is useless if the stone is soft. Do you know why you are really here?" "To be his bride," Amara said, the word feeling strange and heavy on her tongue. "To stabilize the legacy." Eunhee let out a soft, dry laugh. "That is the story we tell the board of directors. You are here because power has a language, and currently, you are mute. You speak with your heart and your reflexes. That makes you a martyr, not a queen. If you are to survive Daesham's world, you must learn to speak with your eyes and listen with your skin." The matriarch pushed a small porcelain cup of tea toward Amara. "Tell me, when the man stepped out of the sedan at the market, what did you see?" Amara frowned, the memory flashing back in cold bursts. "I saw a gun. I saw he was moving toward you. I saw he wasn't looking at me. And that is why you are alive." Eunhee nodded. "But what did his face say? Was he angry? Was he desperate?" "He was blank," Amara whispered, realizing it for the first time. "Like he was doing a chore. Like he was delivering a package." "Exactly." Eunhee leaned forward. "That is the first lesson of the hidden language. The most dangerous people in this world don't shout. They don't sweat. They look like they are already finished with the task. To spot a lie, you do not look at the mouth. The mouth is a paid actor. You look at the pulse in the throat, The way the thumbs tuck into the palms, the way the eyes move when a name is mentioned. A lie is a physical weight, Amara. Even the best liar stumbles under it if you know where the tripwire is. Over the next few hours, the tea grew cold as Eun-hee dismantled the world Amara thought she knew. She taught her that power wasn't about the gun in Daeshim's holster, but the silence he kept before he spoke. She explained the sovereign's gaze, how to enter a room and make everyone else feel like they were intruding. You were a courier, Eun-hee noted, her fingers tracing the edge of her teacup. You spent your days reading the city's shortcuts. You knew which alleys were traps and which lights stayed green. Use that. This syndicate is just another city. The hallways are the streets, and the secrets are the packages. Your job is no longer to deliver them, but to intercept them before they reach the wrong hands. Amara felt a shift in her chest. For the first time since the shooting, the fear began to calcify into something else. Something colder. Something purposeful. She watched Eun-hee's hands, steady, precise, and utterly ruthless with the bonsai. My son is a brilliant man, Eun-hee said, her voice dropping to a whisper. But he is a man of logic. Logic has limits. It cannot account for the desperation of a cornered animal or the treachery of a jealous friend. That is where you come in. You have lived in the cracks of this city. You see the things people like Daeshim are too high up to notice. You will be his eyes in the dirt. The lesson was interrupted by the sound of heavy footsteps. Daeshim appeared in the doorway, his presence immediately sucking the air out of the room. He looked from his mother to Amara, a flicker of something, perhaps pride, perhaps curiosity, crossing his features. Is she learning? Daeshim asked. Eun-hee went back to her tree, the lesson over as quickly as it had begun. She is a fast study. She has the immortality of someone who has already survived the worst the world could throw at her. But be careful, my son. If you sharpen a blade too well, you must be prepared for it to cut anything it touches. Daeshim walked over to Amara, offering his hand to help her up. As she took it, she didn't look at his hand or his face. She looked at the pulse in his neck, just as his mother had taught her. It was steady, rhythmic, and utterly honest. Come, Daeshim said. There are people you need to meet. People who think you are a weakness. Amara stood, smoothing the silk of the borrowed clothes that were slowly becoming her uniform. She didn't feel like the girl on the bike anymore. She felt like a secret being whispered in a room full of shouting men. As she followed Daeshim out, she caught Eun-hee's reflection in the glass of the conservatory. The Iron Matriarch wasn't watching her son. She was watching Amara, a ghost of a smile touching her lips. The bond was sealed. Amara Sterling was no longer just a courier or a bride. She was an apprentice to the throne, and the hidden language of power was beginning to flow through her veins like fire. Jasmine-scented conservatory to the cold, subterranean boardroom of the Park Syndicate felt like a plunge into a frozen lake. This was the stone room, a windowless vault beneath a nondescript skyscraper where the family's lieutenants and regional bosses gathered to carve up the city. Amara walked 2 paces behind Daeshim, her heels clicking against the polished granite with a rhythmic precision that felt like a countdown. She wore a tailored suit of charcoal wool, her hair pulled back so tightly it felt like a helmet. On her finger, the black diamond caught the harsh overhead LEDs, a dark eye watching the room. As they entered, the low hum of conversation died instantly. 20 men, their faces etched with the hardness of a life spent in the shadows, sat around a massive obsidian table. They didn't see the woman who had saved the matriarch. They saw a delivery girl playing dress-up. Daeshim didn't wait for them to settle. He took a seat at the head of the table and, with a subtle tilt of his chin, indicated the empty chair to his right. The silence in the room sharpened. Amara sat, keeping her spine away from the back of the chair, just as Eun-hee had taught her. The girl speaks today, a voice rasped. It was Elder Kong, a man whose skin looked like weathered parchment and whose family had held the city's docks for 40 years. He didn't look at Amara. He looked at Daesham with a mixture of amusement and disdain. "We are discussing the hemorrhage in the West Side distributions, Daesham. This is a matter of logistics and blood, not charity for a brave commoner." A few of the younger captains snickered, the sound dry and mocking. They viewed Amara as a fluke, a political prop used to soften the image of the park transition. "She isn't here for charity, Khan," Daesham said, his voice a low, dangerous vibration. "She is here because none of you can tell me why our shipments are vanishing between the rail yards and the warehouse. You have the greatest mind at this table, and yet my ledgers are bleeding." "The routes are secure," another lieutenant insisted, tossing a folder onto the table. "We use armored couriers. We change the timing every week. It's a phantom." Amara looked at the map projected on the wall, the red lines representing the syndicate's arteries. She felt the heat of the mockery in the room, but she also felt the hidden language he had described. She watched the lieutenant's hand. It was trembling slightly as he adjusted his tie. He wasn't just frustrated, he was terrified. "The routes aren't secure," Amara said. Her voice was quiet, but in the vacuum of the room, it carried like a gunshot. Elder Kong turned his cold gaze toward her. "And what would a girl who delivers sandwiches know about the infrastructure of the park syndicate?" Amara stood up, walking toward the map. She didn't look at the men. She looked at the city. "I didn't deliver sandwiches. I delivered high-priority documents through the West Side for 6 years. I know every pothole, every blind spot, and every alleyway that the city forgot to light." She pointed to a specific intersection near the old meatpacking district. "You're running your armored trucks through the 4th Street corridor because it's the fastest route on paper. But between 2 p.m. and 4 p.m., the loading docks for the textile factory on 5th Street create a bottleneck that forces every vehicle to idle for 6 minutes. It's a dead zone for GPS because of the steel skeletons of the abandoned warehouses." She turned to the lieutenant who had been fidgeting. "You aren't being hijacked by a rival. You're being skimmed. Your drivers are stopping at the 5th Street dock, offloading 2 crates per truck, and because the stone logic says the trucks never left their route, you think the numbers are just an accounting error. You're looking at a map, but you aren't looking at the clock. In my world, if you're 30 seconds late, you don't get paid. In your world, 6 minutes is an eternity of theft." The room went tomb quiet. The lieutenant's face drained of color, his pulse thrumming visibly in his neck, a blatant lie exposed. Amara didn't stop. She looked directly at Elder Kong. "You think my background is a weakness. But I've lived in the spaces you think are beneath you. You see a kingdom, I see a grid. You see subjects, I see moving parts. If you want to stop the bleeding, stop thinking like a king and start thinking like a courier." She sat back down, her heart hammering against her ribs, but her face remained a mask of sterling coldness. Daesham leaned back, a ghost of a smirk touching his lips. He didn't say a word to the men. He simply looked at the lieutenant who had been skimming the crates. 2 of Daesham's personal guards stepped forward, the silent executioners of his will. "It seems," Daesham finally spoke, his eyes never leaving Amara's, "that the girl has a better mind for our business than the men who have been in it for decades. The West Side routes are now Amara's to oversee. If another crate goes missing, I won't be asking the drivers for answers. I'll be asking you." Elder Kang's eyes narrowed, the mockery replaced by a simmering, begrudging respect, and something more dangerous, the recognition of a threat. As the meeting adjourned and the men filed out, looking at Amara with a new, guarded fear, Daesham leaned closer to her. The scent of his scotch was faint but grounding. "Well played, Sovereign," he whispered. "You just made 20 enemies, but you saved $10 million. I'd say that's a fair trade for your first day." Amara looked at her reflection in the obsidian table. She was no longer just the girl who took a bullet. She was the woman who knew where the skeletons were buried, and for the first time, She realized that in this world, knowledge didn't just provide security, it provided a throne. The training room was a cavern of concrete and cold steel, tucked away in the belly of the park estate where the sunlight couldn't reach. It smelled of ozone, sweat, and the faint, bitter tang of gun oil. Amara stood in the center of the padded mats, her breath coming in ragged plumes. She was no longer wearing the silk of a bride or the charcoal wool of a strategist. She was in black tactical gear that felt like a second skin, her knuckles bruised and her muscles screaming from 4 hours of repetitive motion. Daesham stood across from her, his jacket discarded and the sleeves of his white dress shirt rolled up to reveal forearms corded with lean, functional muscle. He hadn't broken a sweat. He moved with a terrifying economy of motion, a man who didn't fight so much as he dismantled obstacles. Again, he commanded. Amara lunged. She was fast, the kind of fast that came from years of weaving a bicycle through gridlocked traffic, but Daesham was already gone. He caught her wrist, his grip like a vice, and pivoted. In a heartbeat, Amara's back hit the mat, the air driven from her lungs in a sharp puff. "You're relying on your speed to escape," Daesham said, his voice low as he hovered over her. He didn't let go of her wrist. Instead, he used his weight to pin her, his body a heavy, warm pressure against hers. In the streets, speed is an asset. In this house, it's a delay. My enemies won't chase you, Amara. They will corner you. You don't run from the cage. You become the thing that makes the cage dangerous. He pulled her up, but he didn't create distance. He stepped into her personal space, his chest nearly brushing hers. He reached out, his fingers tracing the line of her jaw before moving down to adjust the way she held her shoulders. The contact was clinical, but the heat of his skin sent a jolt through Amara that had nothing to do with adrenaline. "Hold your center," he whispered, his breath ghosting over her ear. The greatest mind isn't about knowing every move. It's about being the only variable the enemy can't calculate. When they look at you, they should see grace. When they touch you, they should feel the blade. He handed her a training pistol, his hand lingering over hers as he corrected her grip. The physical proximity was suffocating. For weeks, they had been business partners, co-conspirators in a grand deception, but in the silence of the gym, the political mask was slipping. Amara looked up, finding his dark eyes fixed on her with an intensity that made her throat dry. There was no cold calculation in his gaze now, only a raw, simmering curiosity. "Why are you doing this personally?" Amara asked, her voice steadier than she felt. "You have 100 soldiers who could teach me to shoot." Daesham's hand moved from her grip to the small of her back, guiding her stance. The touch was possessive, a silent claim. "Because I don't trust anyone else to know exactly how dangerous you are becoming. And because..." He paused, his thumb brushing the fabric over her ribs, right where the scar from the bullet resided. "I find I don't like the idea of other men touching the weapon I'm building." The tension in the room shifted, stretching tight, like a wire about to snap. Amara felt the gravity of him, the way he seemed to pull everything in her orbit toward his center. She realized then that the greatest mind wasn't just a title for his business dealings. It was how he moved through the world, claiming what he wanted before the target even knew they were being pursued. She leaned in just a fraction, testing the air between them. "Is that what I am to you, Daesham? A weapon?" He leaned down, his lips inches from hers, the mask of the mafia boss crumbling to reveal the man beneath, the predator who had finally found something he couldn't quite categorize. "You were a weapon the moment you stepped in front of that bullet. Now you're something much more inconvenient." He didn't kiss her. He stepped back, the cold mask snapping back into place as if it had never left, but the air remained charged, heavy with the realization that the contract they had signed in blood was starting to feel like something far more volatile. "Target practice," he said, nodding toward the range. 6 rounds. Headshots only. If you miss, we start the floor drills again." Amara raised the weapon, her heart hammering a rhythm of defiance and desire.
She didn't miss.
Each crack of the suppressed pistol was a punctuation mark on the end of her innocence. She was learning to kill, yes, but as she glanced at Daesham's silhouette in the periphery, she realized she was also learning the most dangerous lesson of all, that in a world built on lies, the only truth she could feel was the heat of the man who had made her his queen. The engagement gala was a sea of shimmering silk and predatory smiles, held in a ballroom that felt more like a glass cage than a celebration. Amara stood at Daesham's side, draped in a gown of crimson lace that mirrored the color of the blood she had spilled on the pavement 3 months prior. The Sterling brand was no longer just a name, it was a statement. As she moved through the crowd, she felt the weight of 1,000 eyes, some filled with curiosity, but most sharpened with the intent to find a crack in her armor. Mrs. Eun-hee sat on a raised dais, a queen mother presiding over a court of vipers. Despite the music and the clinking of crystal, the air felt thin, charged with the same electric stillness Amara used to feel right before a summer storm broke over the city. She kept her sovereign's gaze steady, scanning the room not as a guest, but as a courier watching for a hijacked route. She watched the servers. They moved with a rehearsed grace, but Amara's eyes were trained on the hidden language Eun-hee had taught her. She saw a young waiter in a sharp tuxedo approaching the matriarch's table. To anyone else, he was just a part of the staff. To Amara, he was a variable that didn't fit. His gait was too heavy for someone carrying a tray of light champagne. His thumbs weren't tucked. They were pressed white against the silver rim. And he was sweating, not the heat-induced sheen of a busy worker, but the cold, oily perspiration of a man who knew he was walking toward a cliff. "Daesham," Amara whispered, her voice barely a breath. "The third server on the left. Don't look yet." Daesham didn't flinch. He took a sip of his drink, his eyes scanning the opposite side of the room. "What do you see, Amara?" He's avoiding the floor supervisor's line of sight. "He's gripping the tray like it's a detonator," she murmured, her pulse beginning to quicken. "And he's heading straight for your mother." As the server reached Eun-hee and lowered the tray to offer a flute of vintage Krug, Amara moved. She didn't run. That would be a breach of the grace she had worked so hard to cultivate. She glided, cutting through a group of gossiping lieutenants like a hot wire through wax. Just as Eun-hee's fingers brushed the stem of the glass, Amara's hand shot out, catching the waiter's wrist in a grip that Daesham had taught her to make unbreakable. The tray tilted dangerously. "1,000 apologies, mother," Amara said, her voice projecting a deceptive, honeyed sweetness that carried across the nearest tables. "But I believe this bottle was corked." I could smell the bitterness from across the room. "We cannot have you starting the night with something so unrefined." The waiter's eyes went wide, the pupils dilating in a flash of pure terror. He tried to pull back, but Amara leaned in closer, her face inches from his. "If you drop that tray," she whispered, "you die before the glass hits the floor. Smile and walk back to the kitchen. Now." Daesham was suddenly there, his presence a dark shadow that solidified the trap. He took the glass from the tray with a terrifyingly slow motion. He didn't drink it. He held it up to the light, watching the way the bubbles rose, or rather, the way they didn't. "My bride has an exceptional nose for quality," Daesham said to the surrounding crowd, his voice a calm, lethal boom. "It seems we have a lapse in our catering standards." He handed the glass to Marcus, his head of security, who had appeared out of the shadows like a ghost. "Have this analyzed. And find out which family thought our engagement was an appropriate time for a chemistry lesson." The waiter was led away so quietly it was as if he had evaporated. The music never stopped, and the guests went back to their drinks, but the shift in the room was tectonic. Amara turned to Eun-hee, whose iron-gray eyes were fixed on her with a fierce, burning pride. The matriarch reached out, patting Amara's hand. "You saw the weight of the lie," Eun-hee whispered. "You didn't just save my life again, Amara. You saved our dignity." Daesham stepped up behind Amara, his hand resting possessively on the small of her back. The heat of his palm through the silk of her dress was grounding, a silent acknowledgement of the partnership they were forging. "You did well," he murmured into her ear, his breath a warm contrast to the cold violence of the moment. "You used the streets to protect the throne. They won't try poison again. They've realized the courier sees things they've spent a lifetime trying to hide." Amara looked out at the ballroom, the black diamond on her finger catching the light of the chandeliers. She realized then that the silk she wore was just a different kind of armor, and the blood that would eventually be shed tonight wouldn't be hers. She had intercepted the package. She had redirected the threat. And as she raised her own glass to the room, she knew she wasn't just a bride anymore. She was the sentinel of the Park Empire, and the war was only just beginning. The obsidian silence of the study was broken only by the rhythmic tapping of Amara's fingers against a tablet screen. It was late, that hollow hour of the morning when the city's neon lights began to look like faded bruises. Daesham was away at the docks, and the estate felt like a sleeping giant, breathing through the hum of the ventilation system. Amara wasn't looking for a ghost, but as she combed through the encrypted financial ledgers of the rival Beck syndicate, data she had quietly intercepted during the chaos of the engagement party, a familiar string of numbers caught her eye. It was a social security number. Her father's. The air in the room suddenly felt like ice. Amara leaned in, her eyes scanning the digital ghost in the machine. This wasn't a list of victims or casual gamblers. It was a high-interest debt ledger categorized under collateral assets. Her father, Jerome Sterling, didn't just owe money for a failed repair shop or a bad mortgage. He owed nearly $500,000 to the very people currently trying to put a bullet in Daesham's head. She felt a sickening lurch in her stomach as she traced the dates. The debt didn't start after she took the bullet for Mrs. Eunhee. It started years ago. Every struggle her family had faced, every late-night phone call that made Jerome's hands shake, every random break-in at their old apartment, it hadn't been bad luck. It had been pressure. Amara's mind raced back to the day of the market shooting. She had always viewed it as a freak accident, a moment where she chose to be a hero. But as she looked at a memo attached to her father's file, Asset 402, Strategy for Leverage via Daughter, the truth hit her like a physical blow. The Beck syndicate hadn't just been trying to kill Mrs. Eunhee that day. They had orchestrated a scenario where Amara was supposed to be the collateral damage that broke Jerome, forcing him to turn over the keys to the transit hub where he worked. She hadn't just stumbled into a mafia war 3 months ago. She had been a target since she was 19. Her entire life, her struggle, her chance encounter with the Parks, it was all a web where the threads led back to the same predators. The heavy mahogany door creaked open, and Daesham stepped into the room. He smelled of rain and iron. He saw her face, the way the blue light of the screen reflected in her wide, horrified eyes, and he stopped. He didn't ask what she was doing. He didn't need to. He walked over, his gaze falling on the screen. "You weren't supposed to find that yet," he said, his voice a low, heavy chord. Amara stood up, so abruptly her chair scraped harshly against the floor. "You knew? You knew my father was there, Asset 402? You knew that the shooting wasn't just a random hit?" Daesham reached out, but she stepped back, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. "I knew they were squeezing him," he admitted, his expression a mask of cold pragmatism. "I knew they wanted his access to the rail yards. But I didn't know you would jump in front of that bullet, Amara."
No one could have calculated that.
"So my marriage to you, this sovereignty, it was just a way for you to buy my father's debt?" Her voice cracked, the grace she had practiced so hard failing her. "Am I just a line item on your ledger, Daesham? A strategic move to block the Beck family?" Daesham moved then, closing the distance before she could retreat again. He took her face in his hands, his grip firm and grounding. "I bought the debt to save him. I made you my bride to protect you from the people who were already hunting you. Yes, it started as a move on a board. But look at me, Amara. She looked, searching the greatest mind for a lie. But his pulse, visible in the hollow of his throat, was steady. His eyes weren't looking at an asset. They were looking at a woman who had become his only blind spot. You think you've been in this war for 3 months, he whispered. But the world has been trying to break you for years. I didn't bring you into the fire. I just gave you the armor to survive it. Amara looked back at the screen, at the cold numbers that represented her father's life. The betrayal stung, a bitter tang in the back of her throat, but beneath it, a new fire was stoking. She wasn't just a girl running from a debt anymore. She was the woman who knew exactly who held the ledger. She reached out and deleted the file, the blue light vanishing into black. The Beck Syndicate thinks they still have leverage over my father, she said, her voice turning to steel. They think I'm still the girl on the bike. She looked at Daesham, her eyes narrowing with a lethal clarity. If they've been in my life this long, then it's time I paid them back. With interest. Daesham watched her, a slow, predatory smile spreading across his face. He had trained a weapon, yes, but he realized in that moment that he had also unleashed a storm. The ghost in the machine was dead. Now, the real haunting was about to begin. The war moved from the shadows of obsidian boardrooms to the cracked asphalt of the South Side with a speed that left the city reeling. It began with a smear campaign designed to dismantle Amara's humanity before they dismantled her life. Overnight, the digital landscape was flooded with leaked, doctored images of the sovereign bride, not as a hero who saved a life, but as a traitorous social climber who had sold out her community to serve a foreign empire. The rumors were a poison, whispered in the barbershops and church pews of her old neighborhood, painting Amara as the girl who forgot where she came from to play queen in a golden cage. But the Beck Syndicate didn't stop at character assassination. They knew that to break the greatest mind's weapon, they had to strike at its heart. The breach happened at 3 p.m. on a Tuesday, the exact hour the school buses dropped off the children on Amara's old block. A fleet of black SUVs, windows tinted to the color of ink, tore through the quiet residential street. They weren't there for a surgical strike. They were there for a message. Storefronts where Amara used to deliver packages were sprayed with gunfire. The community center where Malik played basketball was firebombed, the smoke rising in a thick, black pillar that could be seen from the windows of the Park estate. Amara stood in the command center of the mansion, her hands trembling as she watched the live feed from a drone Marcus had deployed. She saw the panic of her neighbors, people who had watched her grow up, scrambling for cover as the Beck soldiers moved with the cold efficiency of an invading army. "They're flushing you out," Daesham said, his voice coming from the shadows behind her. He sounded clinical, detached. "They want you to move without thinking. They want you to leave the protection of this house and run into their crosshairs." "Those are my people, Daesham," Amara snapped, her eyes fixed on a screen showing a grandmother she knew being shoved to the ground. "This isn't a strategic move on a board. This is my home. If you go there as a girl from the neighborhood, you will die with them," Daesham warned, stepping into the light. "If you go there as the sovereign of the Park Syndicate, you change the nature of the conflict. You have to choose which one you are, Amara. You cannot be both today." Amara felt the old life and the new life colliding with the force of a high-speed wreck. She looked at her black diamond ring, then at the tactical vest laying on the table. Her heart was screaming for the girl on the bike, but her mind, the mind Daesham had sharpened, was already calculating the response. "I'm not going there to hide," Amara said, her voice dropping to a lethal, quiet steel. "And I'm not going there to run." She turned to Marcus. "Ready the armored convoy. Not the black ones. Use the white delivery vans we confiscated from the West Side skimming operation. We're going in under the guise of international logistics. And tell the men to swap their rifles for suppressed submachine guns. I want this handled before the local news even realizes who's on the street." As the convoy rolled into her old neighborhood, the air smelled of burnt rubber and fear. Amara sat in the lead van, her pulse steadying into the rhythmic, hidden language of a hunter. When they reached the intersection where the Beck soldiers were preparing to torch a local grocery store, Amara didn't wait for a command. She stepped out of the van, a vision of terrifying grace in a black Kevlar coat. The neighborhood residents froze, recognizing her face from the smears and the news, but the woman standing before them wasn't the girl they remembered. The Beck soldiers turned, their weapons rising, but they were a second too slow. Amara didn't flinch. She fired a single, precise shot into the engine block of their lead vehicle, the courier's knowledge of mechanics guiding her hand. As the engine hissed and died, the park soldiers swarmed from the vans, a silent tide of professional violence that dismantled the hit squad in less than 3 minutes. When the smoke cleared, the neighborhood was silent. Amara stood in the middle of the street, looking at the faces of her people. They didn't cheer. They looked at her with a profound, aching fear. She saw a childhood friend clutching a terrified toddler, looking at Amara as if she were a monster. In that moment, Amara realized the price of her throne. She had saved their lives, but she had lost their love. She was no longer one of them. She was the queen of the shadow world they feared. She walked over to the grocery store owner, a man who had given her free fruit when she was a hungry teenager. She pressed a thick envelope of cash into his hand and gave him a burner phone. "If a black car even turns onto this street again, you press the top button," she told him. He didn't thank her. He just stared at the blood on her sleeve. Amara climbed back into the van, her heart heavy, but her resolve hardened like tempered glass. As they drove back toward the safety of the estate, she looked at Daesham through the rearview mirror. He was watching her with a look of terrifying approval. "You handled the breach," he said. "I saved the block," she replied, looking out at the city she no longer belonged to. "But I think I just finished the job the Beck family started. I'm not a girl from the South Side anymore, am I?" "No," Daesham said, his hand finding hers in the dark. "You're a sovereign, and sovereigns have no home but the empire they build." The silence of the Park estate was shattered not by a bang, but by the hollow, metallic thud of the perimeter sensors being bypassed. Amara was in the library, tracing the layout of the city's shipping lanes, when the emergency lights flickered to a deep, bruised crimson. The air conditioning died, and in the sudden quiet, the rhythmic pulse of a high-altitude drone hummed overhead like a vengeful insect. The Beck Syndicate wasn't sending a message this time. They were sending an ending. "Breach at the North Gate." Marcus's voice crackled over the internal comms, stripped of its usual composure. "They have thermal jamming. We're blind." Amara sprinted toward the master suite, her heels echoing like gunfire against the marble. She found Daesham already at the vault, but he wasn't reaching for a weapon. He was slumped against the reinforced steel, his white shirt blossoming with a jagged, wet stain of red. A sniper's round, fired from the tree line, had caught him through the one panoramic window the shutters hadn't reached in time. "Daesham." Amara dropped to her knees, her hands pressing against the heat of his side. The greatest mind looked pale, his breath hitching in shallow, ragged bursts. "The tactical link." Daesham gasped, shoving a biometric handset into her hand. "The soldiers, they won't follow a ghost, Amara. They need a head. You have to lead them." "I'm not a general, Daesham. I'm a courier," she whispered, her eyes wide with the reflection of the flickering red lights. He grabbed her collar, pulling her close enough that she could taste the iron on his breath. "A courier knows the paths. A courier delivers the package no matter the cost. Deliver my men to safety. Become the immortal my mother saw." The sound of an explosion rocked the floor beneath them. The front doors had been breached. Amara felt the cold weight of the handset in her palm and the black diamond on her finger. She stood up, the fear that had been her constant companion for months suddenly calcifying into a sharp, lethal focus. She stood over the man who had reshaped her life and realized that if he died, the empire died with him. She pressed the comms button. All units, this is the Sovereign. Daesham is down. I am taking command of the park tactical net. A beat of static followed. The soldiers, men who had spent decades in the service of the park bloodline, hesitated. The main hall is a kill zone, Amara continued, her voice projecting a deceptive, icy calm that she had learned from the Iron Matriarch. Marcus, take the rear guard and execute a blackout protocol. Use the ventilation shafts for gas deployment. Everyone else, fall back to the basement coordinates. We are moving through the Sector 4 tunnels. The tunnels are unfinished, ma'am. A voice challenged over the radio. They're a labyrinth. I know every subterranean map of the city from my years on the south sidelines. Amara snapped, her internal map of the city's underside snapping into place. I know where those tunnels lead better than the men who dug them. Fall back, or stay and die for a hallway that doesn't matter. Your choice. One by one, the blue dots on her tactical display began to move toward her. She hauled Daesham's arm over her shoulder, his weight nearly crushing her, but she didn't stumble. She led him toward the hidden panel behind the library's mahogany shelves. As they descended into the damp, lightless veins of the estate, the sounds of the massacre above faded into a dull thud. The tunnels were a nightmare of raw concrete and low-hanging wires, but to Amara, they were just another route. She moved with a frightening certainty, her couriers, instinct navigating the darkness. When they reached a four-way junction where the soldiers stood huddled in confusion, Amara stepped into the center of the huddle. Her face was smudged with Daesham's blood, and her eyes burned with a fire that made even the most hardened mercenaries take a step back. They expect us to exit at the boathouse, she told the gathered men, her voice echoing in the tunnel. So we're going to the old drainage canal under the interstate. It's a mile of mud and narrow pipes, but the Beck Syndicate doesn't have a map for it. We're going to disappear, and then we are going to circle back and cut their throats from the shadows. How do we know we can trust your lead? A soldier asked, his rifle leveled at the dark. Amara stepped toward him until the barrel of his gun touched her tactical vest. Because I've survived a bullet meant for the matriarch, a war in the streets, and a marriage to the most dangerous man in Chicago. I am the only one in this tunnel who knows the way out. You follow me, or you stay in the dark. The soldier lowered his weapon. For the next hour, Amara Sterling led the remnants of a shattered dynasty through the guts of the city. She navigated by the feel of the air and the slope of the ground, dragging Daesham's semi-conscious body through the muck. She wasn't Grace personified anymore. She was a force of nature and immortal who refused to let the Empire fall on her watch. When they finally emerged into the crisp, night air of a hidden access point miles away, the soldiers stood in a semicircle around her. They weren't looking at a delivery girl. They were looking at a leader who had delivered them from the mouth of hell. Amara laid Daesham down on the grass, her hands shaking as the adrenaline began to ebb. Marcus stepped forward, his eyes filled with a new, terrifying respect. The estate is lost, Sovereign, but the army is intact. Amara looked back at the distant glow of the burning mansion on the horizon. She touched the black diamond on her hand, now coated in the grime of the tunnels. The estate was just stone and glass, she said, her voice turning to a cold, final steel. They thought they could trap us in our own home. They forgot that the city belongs to the one who knows how to move through it. She looked at the men, then at the wounded man who had bet his life on her. Ready the weapons. We're not running anymore. We're going to show the Beck family what happens when you try to cage a sovereign. The retribution began not with the roar of engines, but with the silent, rhythmic blinking of a dozen servers in a cold room halfway across the city. Amara sat in the back of a nondescript transit van, her laptop screen illuminating the sharp, focused lines of her face. Daesham sat beside her, his side heavily bandaged and his face pale, but his eyes were fixed on her with a quiet, lethal intensity. He had given her the keys to his digital vault, but it was Amara's courier's mind that was currently weaving through the Beck syndicate's financial arteries. The Beck family expected a bloodbath. They had fortified their bunkers and doubled their street patrols, waiting for the park soldiers to arrive with fire and lead. They were looking for a war they understood, one fought with bullets. They weren't prepared for the woman who knew how to intercept the fuel that kept their machine running. The Beck family operates on a just-in-time credit cycle, Amara whispered, her fingers flying across the keys. They don't hold cash, they hold debt. They move their profits through 3 different shell companies in the shipping district, the same district where I used to spend 14 hours a day. I know their transit codes. I know their dead zones. She didn't aim for their lives. She aimed for their gravity. With a final, decisive keystroke, Amara initiated a massive, coordinated short sell of the Beck's front corporations, while simultaneously rerouting their offshore holdings into a dead letter account, the digital equivalent of a package lost in the mail. By the time the sun began to peek over the Chicago skyline, the Beck syndicate wasn't just defeated. They were bankrupt. Their soldiers' paychecks bounced. Their suppliers stopped answering the phone. The stone of their empire had turned to sand. "It's done," Amara said, the blue light of the screen fading as she closed the lid. "By noon, their own lieutenants will be looking for a new employer. You don't need to kill them, Daesham. You just need to buy them." Daesham looked at the screen, then at the woman who had delivered a victory more absolute than any massacre could have achieved. He reached out, his hand covering hers, and for the first time, there was no calculation in his touch, only the raw weight of a partnership that had survived the fire. "You didn't just save the dynasty," he said, his voice a low, vibrating silk. "You evolved it." Weeks later, the dust had settled. The park estate was being rebuilt, but the power dynamic had shifted forever. Amara stood on the balcony of their new penthouse, looking out at the city. She was no longer wearing the black Kevlar of a soldier or the borrowed silk of a victim. She wore a suit of midnight velvet, a sovereign in her own right. Jerome and Malik were safe, relocated to a secure, luxurious estate in the suburbs with a cover story that finally held weight. Jerome had been told the debt was settled by a high-end logistics firm Amara now co-owned. It was a partial truth, the only kind that survives in this world. Daesham stepped out onto the balcony, standing not behind her, but beside her. They didn't look like a boss and his bride. They looked like the twin pillars of a new era. The strategic marriage that had begun with a bullet and a desperate choice had morphed into something deeper, something earned in the tunnels and the boardrooms. "The Kim family wants a meeting," Daesham noted, looking at the horizon. "They're asking for the sovereign." Amara touched the black diamond on her finger, the light catching its dark, unbreakable surface. She thought of the girl on the bike, the ticking clock of the delivery app, and the cold shock of the lead. That girl was gone, but her spirit, the part of her that knew how to find a way through the impossible, remained. "Tell them I'll see them at 2, Amara said, her gaze steady and lethal. "But tell them to be on time. I don't like to be kept waiting." Daesham smiled, a genuine, predatory flash of pride. He took her hand, and together they looked out at the city that had once tried to swallow them whole. They were no longer running from the fire. They were the ones who controlled the flame. The new dynasty had arrived, and it was built on the grace of a woman who knew that the most dangerous delivery of all was the one you made for yourself. And that, besties, is how Amara Sterling turned a bullet into a throne. She didn't just survive the game. She rewrote the rules. But the city is never quiet for long, and there are already whispers of a new shadow rising from the docks. If you want to see what happens when the Sovereign meets her first true rival, you know what to do. Like this video, drop a comment with the word immortal if you stayed until the very end, and hit that subscribe button.